Portrait of a Haitian Woman, originally titled Portrait of a Negro Slave, was created in 1786 by François Beaucourt, a Quebec-born painter. The document places Beaucourt and his wife in Saint-Domingue, now known as Haiti, on the eve of the Haitian Revolution in 1791. The sitter is assumed to be Marie-Therese Semir, documented as owned by Beaucourt's wife. Portrait of a Haitian Woman is crucial to Canadian studies of Black enslavement because it is the only known fully finished high art portrait of an enslaved Black person in Canada, and because Beaucourt was the artist, the enslaver, and the patron at once. Oil portraits cost $100 to $200 and was gaining popularity in the 18th century amongst wealthy white families and patrons, who took advantage of showcasing their wealth in transatlantic goods through what they included as props alongside the sitter. White portrait sitters typically controlled their likenesses because they were also routinely the patrons of the portraits. Portrait of a Negro Slave was an arbitrary title not given by Beaucourt. His deliberate choice in the lack of name or description allows us to understand that this was less of a portrait, but Beaucourt's white male gaze on the Black exoticized body. Including a tropical landscape was part of a growing tactical stereotype geared towards racializing the tropics, making the Black body seem as if it naturally resided there, when on the contrary, Saint-Domingue was colonized by France, who were enslaving peoples from Africa. Marie's head wrap demonstrates her retention of Africans' dress practices within the French colony of Saint-Domingue, where a large percentage of the enslaved was African-born. Beaucourt uses fruit beside her exposed breast to allude to Mary's fruitfulness of life and breeding potential. Beaucourt asserted his dominance not just over Marie's labor and where she came from, but how her body performed for him. This Clarence silk blue dress, made about 1818, exemplifies the transatlantic slave trade through the specific material and pigment utilized in its production. The dress was owned by Phoebe Caroline Jones Patterson, daughter of General Edmund Jones and Anne Lenore. Phoebe grew up in North Carolina on the Palmyra Plantation, part of the Happy Valley Patriarch. Countries fought insistently for the dominance over transatlantic trade. Slavery was abolished in France in 1794, but reinstated in 1802 by Napoleon. To aid him in the seizure of lands, reinstate relations with the Levant, and block Britain's route to India, making silk a more expensive commodity for Britain to obtain. Spitalfields in London, England, was the home for the production of these silk dresses, ranging from $100 to $500. During 1773 to 1824, the Spitalfield Acts were created so that they had to fairly pay their journeymen, merchants, and weavers, no longer allowing them to exploit their labor force to increase profit. Blue pigment came from lapis and could only be found in Afghanistan, the source which Egypt had been exploiting and for which France exploited Egypt. These rich pigments that were difficult to acquire and became a commodity associated with the Orient, representing wealth. In the early 1700s in Germany, Johann Jakob Diesbach synthesized a blue pigment known as Prussian blue. In 1818, the German Duchess Adelaide popularized this color in fashion during her wedding to William, Duke of Clarence. Prussian blue then came to be known as Clarence blue. Through magazines like the Portfolio, published in Philadelphia, readers received detailed descriptions of trends in fashions, housewares, and activities in Paris and London. Through this Clarence silk blue dress owned by Phoebe Caroline Jones Patterson, a wealthy woman, daughter of a plantation owner, we can make the connection to the transatlantic slave trade.
The history painting Death of Major Pearson, January 6, 1781, painted by American artist John Singleton Copley, is a 100 by 144-inch oil painting on canvas. On display permanently at the Tate Gallery in London, England, this history painting features a scene from the Battle of Jersey, part of the American Revolution, fought on the island of Jersey in the Canal Islands of France. The Battle of Jersey was the last French attempt to seize the island of Jersey from the British, and shows at its center several royal officers carrying the dead body of Major Francis Pearson. Major Francis Pearson was a British Army officer who was serving in Jersey. The painting commemorates the death of Major Pearson and his refusal to surrender as the island of Jersey was successfully defended by the British, and this would be one of the last battles to take place in the British Islands. In this imposing painting, the French soldiers can be seen taking their stand around the statue of George II, shown past the battle in a hazy middle ground of browns, grays, and beiges. Just below the statue, we see the retreating French officers holding up the wounded soldier. A cannon separates the cluster of French soldiers and the fleeing family of Major Pearson. Exiting the canvas from the lower left corner of the composition, his son, dressed in a complimentary green suit, engages the audience in a frightened stare as his mother looks back to witness the death of her husband. On the other side of the painting, we see further British reinforcements visible from the hill at the top left. The bright red of the British uniform and the bright red blood of Major Pearson against his white shirt centers the viewer's eyes to the drama the artist John Singleton Copley is creating for us. The first scene created by an American artist of an armed black soldier being celebrated for taking the life of a white soldier. Described as Pearson's trusted servant Pompey, adds to the heroism of the moment. Pearson, a British hero, after dying in the heat of battle, his death is avenged by his black servant, resplendent in the Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment uniform. Copley weaves an American tale dressed in European military splendor by placing the black soldier in the middle of the painting, wearing a contrasting uniform. Copley exhibited this politically charged painting in 1784 in an exhibition of that same name. The fact that Pompey is the only black figure represents a rare example from 18th century of a black man being portrayed in such a prominent and masculine way. This memoir, entitled The Memoir of Boston King, a Black Preacher, written by himself at his residency at Kingswood School, was written by a formerly enslaved black man named Boston King in 1798. Memoir is classified in the genre of slave narratives, notable as one of 3 created by black loyalist ministers who lived in South Carolina before and during the American Revolution, and also among slave narratives as a work that is also transatlantic. Filled with details of black loyalist settlements of Nova Scotia in the 1800s, Memoir was written retrospectively in 1798 while King was studying in London, England. The slave document is written in first person and spans Boston's early life in America as an apprentice to a master carpenter, attendant to an officer of the British militia in New York during the American Revolution, and his ordination and influence in what would become the African Methodist Episcopal Church community of Nova Scotia. Boston and his wife would be among the 1,196 that boarded the 15 ships carrying black loyalists in search of dignity and self-governance in Sierra Leone in 1792. This would lead to Boston's invitation to England in 1794 to study at one of the oldest Methodist institutions in the world. While there, he wrote this autobiography, stating it was written by himself, and was published in 1798 in installments in the Methodist magazine. It is important to note that Methodists were among the 3,500 black loyalists that came to Nova Scotia at the close of the Revolutionary War. King experienced a religious revelation while in Nova Scotia, and in early 1785, King was converted and baptized as a Methodist minister. He would be ordained, and for the next few years, King preached in black settlements from Shelburne to Preston. In 1794, King migrated to Britain, where he was invited to study at the Kingswood School, where he stated that I might be better qualified to teach the natives. He continued to preach while in Britain, and would later immigrate to Sierra Leone, where he would become the first Methodist missionary to the indigenous people of Sierra Leone. Boston King's memoir would be re-released, and the title shortened to Memoirs of the Life of Boston King, a Black Preacher, by Ruth Holmes Whitehead and Carmelita Robinson in 2003.
This is an oil-on-canvas painting created by Nicolas de Largellière in 1696 in Paris, France. The painting is titled Portrait of a Woman, possibly Madame Claude Lambert de Thornier, and an enslaved servant. It is currently on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. In this 3/4 length portrait, Largellière has painted a French upper-class white woman in the center of the canvas, surrounded by fine architecture and dressed in an elaborate pink gown. On her left, a macaw is perched on the stone fountain, and on her right in the upper corner, we see a classical marble statue. Directly below this and in the sitter's dark shadow, the viewer can vaguely make out a short black boy. The black child is holding a small dog and is wearing a modest uniform with a cap and a slave collar. This collar indicates his status and symbolizes his enslaver's power. Slave collars were dehumanizing and often used as a precaution against escape. It could only be removed with a key that the enslaver kept hidden. If the enslaved person did escape, they could be easily identified and returned, given the visibility of the collar and the inscription on its tag. The collar therefore marked their body as a possession, which aided the enslaver in their recapture. This painting is part of a French and more broadly transatlantic world portrait tradition that depicts Black enslaved children as marginal figures pushed to dim corners. They were strategically used by white artists alongside luxury objects and exotic animals to both heighten the whiteness and the elite status of the sitter. Both the parrot and the enslaved black boy in this painting therefore function as symbols of world travel, so-called exotic luxuries, and ultimately colonial expansion. Furthermore, the juxtaposition of the dog and the enslaved boy speaks to the views that white people held, in which Black people were seen as animals and loyal pets to European enslavers. The sitter has been identified as possibly being Madame Lambert de Thornier, who is also known by her maiden name as Marie Marguerite Bontemps, who married Jean-Baptiste Lambert in 1682. Although the connection of this portrait to Madame Lambert remains speculative, further research is required to determine who the unnamed Black enslaved child is. He was presumably owned by the Lambert family and likely labored as a domestic, since the temperate climate of France could not sustain year-round plantations. He would have lived in their household, where he would have been forced to serve this white family. The portrait therefore challenges the widespread narrative that, quote, there are no slaves in France, when in reality, enslaved people resided in both French colonies and the metropole. However, this painting simultaneously sanitizes the horrors of slavery in France, where enslaved people may have avoided the violence of plantation slavery, but nonetheless regularly experienced physical, psychological, and sexual abuse, as well as the extraordinary isolation from culture and community that the enslaved suffered in Europe. This is a slave or animal collar made of bronze and silver that was created in the 18th or 19th century by a metalsmith in either Canada, the US, or the Caribbean. The smith may have been white, a free Black, or an enslaved person, since the enslaved were sometimes trained as skilled tradesmen by their enslavers. The collar features chain links, an engraved tag, and a lock on the back that can only be opened with a key to either adjust the length of the collar or to remove it. It is currently held at the King's Landing Historical Settlement in Sussex, New Brunswick, where they have previously labeled it a slave collar. This labeling has recently been contested, in which researchers have argued that it was instead used on animals. According to the engraved tag, the collar was originally owned by an A. de Mille of Sussex, which indicates that it could have been the property of the de Mille family, who had a history of owning enslaved people. The de Milles were originally from Connecticut and arrived in New Brunswick in 1783 as loyalists. John de Mille brought with him his wife, children, and one enslaved 22-year-old man named Joshua. The A. de Mille could possibly signify either John's son, Abraham de Mille Jr., who resided in Hampton in the mid-1790s, which was formed from parts of Kingston and Sussex around the same time that he moved there. Or it could be Abraham de Mille Sr., John's father, who was a West Indian planter, that may have sent John an enslaved person wearing the collar. It is difficult to determine who the enslaved person was who may have been forced to wear this collar. They likely worked seasonally as a field laborer and more often as a domestic laborer, since Canada's climate could not sustain year-round plantations. Domestic enslaved people frequently lived in their enslavers' homes, which fostered an environment replete with physical, psychological, and sexual violence. If this artifact is a slave collar, it would have been used as an instrument of torture, while serving as a preventive measure against enslaved people trying to run away. If they did escape, the collar made it so that they could be easily identified and returned. These collars were heavy, uncomfortable, and dehumanizing, since they were used to humiliate the enslaved who were treated like animals by enslavers. Ultimately, slave collars were used as tools to both inflict physical and psychological suffering. Nevertheless, identical collars were also worn by dogs and livestock, and it is possible that this collar has been mislabeled a slave collar and can be attributed to a different aide-de-mille in New Brunswick after emancipation in 1834. Regardless, since we may never know who or what the collar was exactly intended for, the fact that both animal and slave collars are identical speaks volumes about the dehumanization of the enslaved.
This illustration was featured in a book titled Voyage pittoresque dans les deux Amériques, published in 1836 by Alcide d'Orbigny. He was chosen by the French National Museum of Natural History to complete an expedition to South America from 1826 to 1833, exploring natural specimens and the peoples of South America. Upon his return to Paris, the book was published in 10 volumes and was said to be popular and widely distributed. Illustrations such as this one were prints from intaglio engravings based on drawings by de Saint-Cyr and Jules Boilly. In Argentina, enslaved people were most visible in the field of domestic service, forming a crucial part of any well-to-do family in Buenos Aires. Between 1700 and 1750, French and British companies brought around 14,000 enslaved people to Argentina. In 1813, a law known as the Law of Freedom by the Womb mandated that children born to enslaved mothers as of 1813 were free, called libertos. This is likely the status of the young boy shown in the illustration. Libertos were required to serve the owner of their mother until at least age 16. Under this law, enslavers sometimes took pregnant enslaved women out of the country to give birth, so that the child could be born into slavery and remain in bondage throughout their life. Several laws and treaties to restrict slave trade were passed in the 5 decades following this law before slavery was officially abolished in 1861, known as a period of gradual abolition. However, the slave trade continued to thrive during this time through clandestine trade and special slaveholding permits granted to elite families. The author of this book describes the elaborate headdresses of the elite women illustrated here. Referred to as the comb, the decoration and quality of this piece depended on the rank and fortune of the woman, as well as the occasion for which it was worn. Worn to church, it would be paired with a black dress and veil. However, the accessory most signifying a woman's status and wealth was a black domestic servant, in groom's costume, here shown carrying a rug for the woman to kneel on in church and ready to attend to her during the services. To the elites of Buenos Aires, enslaved black children were an object of luxury and status. This posting was published in the Nova Scotia Chronicle and Weekly Advertiser on June 6th in 1769 by an unknown author. This newspaper was first established this same year and regularly featured tide tables, shipping news, weather reports, and advertisements. A section titled Halifax, June 6 states that 2 Negro women named Quine and Flora were recently tried, convicted, and sentenced to receive 25 lashes at the public whipping post for the stealing of sundry articles, likely food or clothing, from a man named John Cunningham. The lack of last names listed for Quine and Flora most likely indicates enslaved status. The date of this posting indicates that they may have arrived during the New England planter migration. This migration took place following the Nova Scotian government's offer of free land to planters in New England, who were promised an additional 50 acres for every enslaved black person brought with them. Cunningham arrived to Nova Scotia from Ireland around 1760, owned several plots of land across Halifax and Windsor, and even held public office. It is unclear if John Cunningham legally owned Quine and Flora, but he included one male servant in his will. He may have been a particularly brutal master, as shown by a Hants County court case from 1787, where he was tried and acquitted for murdering an enslaved boy, allegedly by a blow with a hammer. Enslaved people were sometimes punished for crimes committed against their owner, which may have been the case for Quine and Flora. The practice of publicly whipping black people for minor offenses was common, administered to both free and enslaved blacks in order to humiliate them and reinforce their status as chattel in society. These whippings continued into the 1820s. The whipping post in Halifax, mentioned here, was built in 1758 as part of the construction of a workhouse, just east of present-day Queen Street and just north of Spring Garden Road. At this particular workhouse, there was a black man known as Constable Hawkins who had been employed at the workhouse for some time to do the whipping. This is part of a larger Canadian practice of forcing black people into the role of executioner, and uncovers another element to this violent form of entertainment. White spectators were free to enjoy the spectacle without the burden of blood on their hands.
This art piece is a watercolor painting, a miniature portrait measuring 37 millimeters by 32 millimeters, of Captain Walter Patterson, painted on an oval piece of ivory. This piece, created by an artist whose name has been lost to anonymity but was likely a white European, was made circa 1770. In 18th century Britain, portraits were a principal means of self-fashioning, and this painting was no exception. The use of ivory as a material was directly related to trade with and colonization of African countries, and was a material that spurred a renaissance in miniature painting. This form of watercolor miniatures were an intimate and portable memento, which often were commissioned when the individual gifting the item might be separated from the recipient by long distances. This was regularly the case for those Europeans, such as Captain Walter Patterson, who were actively involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Patterson was the first governor of what was later to be called Prince Edward Island, and in 1770 he arrived on the island with an entourage of servants and slaves, including his mulatto mistress, Susanna Toriano. Regardless of whether or not Toriano was enslaved, the vast social disparity between a woman of African descent and a white man of Patterson's status would have ensured a relationship characterized by stark power imbalances. Therefore, the term concubine is more fitting for Toriano than mistress. In 1774, Toriano received from Patterson a grant of an island off the coast near Charlottetown. Was Patterson's gift of land to Toriano a benevolent gesture? Or did it allow him to further isolate her and provide a remote area where he could enact his will on his mulatto mistress? Though she was said to have arrived with a servant herself, Toriano's specific position in the Patterson household is unclear. Patterson certainly was not an abolitionist. In 1781, he personally enacted laws supporting the institution of slavery, becoming the only lawmaker in the Atlantic provinces to actively put legislation into effect which supported slavery. Considering this context, who might have been the recipient of Patterson's miniature? Did he commission the miniature portrait for his wife's benefit? Did he send it to relatives back in England to remind them of his successes? Or did he leave it with Toriano herself? This tiny memento, only 3 centimeters tall, was a symbol of the power, wealth, and imperial control of the man who commissioned it, painted on ivory derived from the slave trade that Patterson profited from, and so many others suffered under. This court record, Petition Judico Sisti for apprehending a black slave, is held in the National Records of Scotland and tells a story of self-made liberation. In 1770, a formerly enslaved man known as David Spence, through the pen of a Scottish court recorder, stated, "I am now by the Christian religion liberate and set at freedom from my old yoke, bondage, and slavery, and by the laws of this Christian land there is no slavery nor vestige of slavery allowed." Referring to Spence's liberation from his former owner, David Dalrymple, this was the first time baptism had been used to legally free an enslaved person according to Scottish law. Dalrymple was a Scottish man who purchased an enslaved man known as Black Tom while on a trip to Grenada. Dalrymple brought Tom to Scotland, where he planned to keep him for a while before reselling him back in the West Indies. Tom had no intention to go back to the slave markets of the Caribbean, so cleverly, in the middle of the night, on September 1st, 1769, Tom came to a minister named Harry Spence to be baptized, which would legally exempt him from slavery. Tom was rebaptized with the name David Spence. On the day that the newly named Spence was due to return to the West Indies, he eloped from the house and was taken in by John Henderson. Spence and Henderson together made a legal protest to Dalrymple, stating that because Spence had been baptized, he was no longer heathen and therefore no longer a slave. This case came at an important time in the history of slavery in Scotland, just prior to total abolition. In fact, the case might well have seen slavery declared illegal 8 years before it was. However, Dalrymple died in 1770 before the case could be heard. The evidence from the court papers stops here, but it is understood that with the passing of Dalrymple, there was no contestation of the legality of his freedom, and David Spence was finally a free man. It would be another 8 years before Scottish law changed to officially denounce slavery, and we can only guess and hope that Spence lived to see it. This document shines light on an instance of legal self-liberation by a black man in Britain in the mid-18th century.
This portrait, entitled Hannah Jarvis Nee Owen Peters and her daughters Maria Lavinie and Augusta Honoria Jarvis, was completed by American-British portrait painter James Earl between 1791 and 92, and it depicts the women of the Jarvis family as well-established and healthy ex-Americans living in England after fleeing the effects of the Revolutionary War. This painting was completed before the family's immigration and settlement later that same year in Upper Canada. 3 servants are recorded as having been brought with the Jarvises across the Atlantic Ocean. It is, however, unknown if these were related to the 6 enslaved peoples that are mentioned as having lived within their Caroline Street residence in York. Hannah Jarvis is often infantilized in historical records despite her power over enslaved peoples that was used to dehumanize them, as is cited in a letter from Henry Lewis, an enslaved man who ran away from the Jarvis family. Even in their painted likeness, Hannah and her 2 daughters are idealized as the perfect white subject matter. Angela Rosenthal argues the clear and notably pale skin of all 3 sitters is constructed as a reflection of the inner workings of their bodies. The red flush on their cheeks tells us these subjects are alive, human, and emotionally capable. While Hannah and her older daughter greet the viewer with their gazes, the youngest daughter sits in Hannah Jarvis's lap, focused on her older sister, offering from a plentiful basket a ripened red strawberry. Often referred to as heartberries, strawberries have long been a symbol of colonial expansion as they do not natively grow in England. Also important to note that their role as the first berry to ripen after winter positions them as a symbol of life, health, and medicine for the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Chinookan peoples who live in and around the area referred to as Upper Canada. The representation of strawberries within the painting Hannah Jarvis and her daughters physically places the exploitation of the land and Indigenous and Black peoples within a portrait that sought to celebrate colonial expansion within white supremacy. In 1798, Henry Lewis, an enslaved man who had escaped to Schenectady, New York, wrote a 2-page letter to his former enslaver William Jarvis in Upper Canada. Within, he requested permission to purchase himself from the Jarvis family in order to obtain legal documentation that he was a free black man. Lewis's letter is an attempt to attain a sense of security and control over his freedom. Lewis would have been aware that angry and powerful enslavers were notorious for hunting down enslaved runaways, and that slave catchers would frequently kidnap and sell free or runaway black enslaved peoples to enslavers in pro-slavery states, countries, or colonies. Despite the common practice of kidnappers destroying free papers, it is also well documented, like in the case of Ona Judge, that free and enslaved black peoples were looking out for and working to protect each other from the threats of transatlantic slavery. The potential safety Lewis could have obtained through these papers would also have made the possibility of family, community, and reconnecting to cultural practices more likely. Lewis never defines his reason for running to Schenectady, but it is possible that Lewis may have been brought from New York with an enslaver during the Loyalist migration, or that because of New York's rumored reputation as a site of enslaved rebellions, like the slave insurrection of 1741, he may have thought he would find some community in like-minded folks. Lewis's mention of Joseph Yates, the mayor of Schenectady, as the person William Jarvis should respond to, supports the idea that Lewis had well-connected friends there. While there is much known of Jarvis's life before and after 1798, and Yates' political and legal career can be tracked through a number of sources, the dehumanization of enslaved people meant that their experiences were often only documented in relationship to interactions with enslavers or abolitionists. The only reason this letter exists in an archive is because it was addressed to William Jarvis. We can assume that because the letter was located within the William Jarvis papers of the Toronto Public Library Special Collections, that it was received by Jarvis, but unfortunately, any form of a response, in return, correspondences to Joseph Yates, or a demand of Lewis's return have not been located in that or other collections.
A small 1773 engraving depicting American poet Phyllis Wheatley was used as a frontispiece for Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, a book she wrote and first published in London in 1773. The reproduced copy of the Wheatley portrait in this exhibition is from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Other copies reside in the Library of Congress, the Benneke Rare Book and Manuscript Library of the Yale University Library, and the National Portrait Gallery of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. Phyllis Wheatley was likely born sometime in 1753 and died December 5, 1784. She was the first Black American known to have published a book, and she was the first American woman to earn a living from her writing. This is a staggering achievement given that she arrived in the colonies directly from Africa as an enslaved 7-year-old girl. Her mastery of English within 16 months upon arrival to Boston is impressive, but exceeded by her achievements in Greek and Latin, and the publication of her first poem at 14. Her book drew praise from George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Voltaire, among others, and helped Wheatley gain her freedom. All these achievements, though singular, were supported, if not enabled, by her enslavers in ways that are complex and compromising, even by the standards of the time. The engraving is thought to have been made from a lost painting or drawing by Scipio Moorhead, an artist living near Wheatley at the time, who was himself an enslaved person of African descent. A first edition of Wheatley's Poems on Various Subjects, with this portrait as its frontispiece, was sold in 2017 in Maryland for $22,500. A circa 1862 photograph taken by an uncredited photographer is from the Provincial Archives of New Brunswick and is entitled First Nations Guide Holding a Paddle with Birch Bark Canoe. Thinking about canoes in the Canadian context, activities of Indigenous people and the fur trade usually spring to mind. And yet the canoe may have played an important role in the history of resistance to Canadian slavery. Think of a canoe as a getaway car. Think of the abundant waterways in places like New Brunswick as highways. According to scholar Jan Kurth, enslaved Black men often had some access to rivers in canoes. Bonds of friendship between enslaved people of African descent and Indigenous people could have facilitated escape, given the latter's access to canoes, knowledge of their control, as well as routes and safe destinations. Two known fugitive slave advertisements indicate that escape by enslaved Black people by way of canoe did in fact happen. In a July 1791 Quebec Gazette ad, we learn that self-emancipator Chloe made a plan that involved carrying a substantial amount of clothing in summertime weather and accompaniment by a knowledgeable male, possibly Indigenous or of African descent, using a canoe as their getaway vehicle. Another ad from 1816 in the Royal Gazette of New Brunswick describes self-emancipator Lidge as being last seen in a canoe, quote, going down, end quote, the St. John River. The same river pictured almost 50 years later in the image included in this exhibition. What might we learn with more time to study primary source material related to Canadian slavery if we were to make a collection of such ads specifically referencing canoes?
This portrait of George Ramsay, 9th Earl of the Scottish Kingdom of Dalhousie, painted by Scottish portraitist John Watson Gordon upon his appointment as the Governor-General of India in 1839, also signals his departure from his position of Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia from 1816 to 1820, and Governor-in-Chief of Canada from 1820 to 1828. In grand neoclassical style, the oil painting features the regally garbed, white-skinned body of the 9th Earl of Dalhousie protruding alongside a table and column from a shadowy, undefined background. In the oil portrait, he wears the uniform of the Governor-General of India, both representing and enacting this man's colonial esteem. The painting is a material manifestation of the massive influx of British wealth generated by the slave trade and was likely commissioned by William Henry IV, King of Britain, during the execution of the painting. George Ramsay's portrait is relevant to slavery in Nova Scotia in that he governed the province for 4 of the 29 years between the abolition of the slave trade throughout the Empire in 1807 and the abolition of the practice of slavery altogether in 1836. So these years were 1816 to 1820. During this time, and beginning in 1812, the province saw the arrival of 2,000 black refugees from the War of 1812, whom stepped into a colonial government that sought to use them as a semi-captive and cheap labor force in a society permeated by anti-black racism that saw African-descended people as solely suited to servitude and enslavement. In an 1816 letter regarding the black refugees written by Ramsay and sent to Earl Bathurst, he describes the black refugees as, quote, slaves by habit and education, end quote, despite their legally free status. Ramsay also officiated Dalhousie College, now Dalhousie University, which received its original endowment in part with revenue from custom duties on slave-made goods from the West Indies. This painting and Ramsay's oversight of Nova Scotia highlight British economic reliance on slavery even in northern cities, and the hypocrisy of freeing African American refugees while holding enslaved people in bondage in their own empire, and how this mixed labor system created a tenuous life for the black refugees. The editorial column, titled Peculiar Hoax, was written by Charles Bennett Ray, African American abolitionist and editor of The Colored American, an African American newspaper based in New York City from 1837 to 1842. The clipping is stored in the Black Abolitionist Archive at the University of Mercy Detroit, an archive constituted to highlight African abolitionists in a movement that is retrospectively curated as an act of wealthy white charity. During the period of transatlantic slavery, print was developed as a technology of surveillance of enslaved persons through forms like fugitive slave advertisements, but in the editorial Peculiar Hoax, we can see the development of a black counter-discourse to that in white-owned newspapers. The editorial, published and circulated in the northern and northeastern portions of America in late April of 1841, is a response to an editorial published in the Boston Reporter by the American Colonization Society, whereby they notify their readers of their financial sponsorship of the emigration of previously enslaved and freeborn African Americans to the African Republic of Liberia, a project referred to as emigration and colonization. Bennett uses his editorial to warn his community of the coerced deportation and reminds readers that African Americans are rightful citizens of the United States, and Bennett may have been playing on the fact that slavery was widely known as the peculiar institution in the title of the editorial. Contained in this back and forth is the hardening ideology of race as a transference of the enslaver-enslaved relationship that permeated the transatlantic world. The American Colonization Society was a largely white abolitionist group whose expressed purpose was the purchasing and freeing of enslaved persons and in paying for their passage to the west coast of Africa. Bennett Ray's peculiar hoax editorial is a reminder that the contemporary narrative of abolition is often skewed through historicizing a complex social movement as a unidimensional quest for justice. Such emigration practices must be understood as intentional eugenic practices aimed at the whitening of North America preceding the abolition of slavery, which reflects the white desire to control and restrain Black mobility and belonging.